Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Jody Jacobson-Fry. I'm co-chair of the Workplace Suicide Prevention Committee. Welcome to our webinar today on harm reduction and reducing lethal means with Dr. Jeff Thompson. I'm very honored to have Dr. Thompson with us today. And if we go to the next slide, we will see a little bit about him. Dr. Thompson is an adjunct associate research scientist at the Molecular Imaging and Neuropathology Division in the Psychiatry Department at Columbia University Medical Center, New York State Psychiatric Institute. Dr. Thompson is an instructor at various universities, as well as a crisis counselor, former hostage negotiator, and an 18-year veteran detective in the New York PD, where he is the department's mental health and wellness coordinator. We're very thrilled to have him here today. Next slide. So today's webinar is part of the National Guidelines for Workplace Suicide Prevention. And this is forged through a partnership with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and the United Suicide Survivors International. Next slide. The national guidelines are founded on 8 guiding principles, and today's presentation is going to focus on the principle of harm reduction. Next slide. We also have 9 practices that help us guide us in making suicide prevention a health and safety priority. And today we'll be focusing on mitigating risk. So I'm very excited to turn over our presentation to Dr. Thompson to talk with us about this important topic. Thank you for being here.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much for having me. And honestly, it's a real honor. And you look at what you just shared with each of those and how one thing I'm talking about harm reduction and lethal means reduction, but it truly is interconnected with each of the others, and they don't operate in isolation, but honing in on lethal means reduction, truly, I think is arguably one of the most complex ones when we look at it, especially when we look at specific professions. And from my main background in law enforcement, but also in the medical field as well, and having not only access, but it's part of the work that we do. When we talk about lethal means, first of all, well, what does it mean? Lethal means it's having access to, if someone is suicidal, that can take their life. And we look at, there's a variety of different means that someone can use to attempt to die by suicide or unfortunately die by suicide. And we also, though, it's really important to point out, it's not always necessarily just intent, right? Because sometimes people might not realize the means that they're trying to die by suicide is lethal. And it could go around the other way too. They might think it's lethal and it not necessarily is. And again, it's truly important, not just think about this also, and there's a lot of different directions we can go with this. It's not just the person also that has possession of the lethal means. If they live in a family setting or they have a partner or a spouse, it's then they have access to that as well. So of course, some obvious examples can be firearms, but also let's not talk about cutting instruments. Also, what about there's medications or even poisons or certain heavy types of machinery as well. And ultimately, we look at it then, if there's a variety of different lethal means and based on the professions we're in, it can't be just one cookie cut design. For example, what works in law enforcement, you can't just take and put into the medical profession, or what works in, say, the construction field. You can't take that and apply it to whether it's law enforcement, medical, or another type of profession, but it can help and guide it. And that's the key, I think, here too, is learning from different areas. And for the example, some of the work I've been involved in, what have we done? What seems to work well? And then how do we take that and how do we apply it to other areas, but not just other areas? How can we get better at what we're currently doing, including law enforcement and in the medical field as well? And I think that's critical because has there been progress made? Absolutely. Is there some research out there that's very helpful? Without a doubt, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I want to be very clear with that. And ultimately we look at it, excuse me, in law enforcement. And I'm not speaking on behalf of one particular agency. Of course, my job, I'm a detective in the NYPD. I'm their mental health and wellness coordinator, but I'm speaking more from I would say national, but also global perspective, and having worked with law enforcement agencies across the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of Europe as well. It's trying to share that information, but then in working and collaborating with suicide prevention groups as well. And so one of the key things here, and I know in part preaching to the choir of some of the people that are here live, and I'm not sure watching the recording of this, we need to recall how important quite often the statistics show when somebody attempts to die by suicide, or also when somebody does die by suicide, that the act often is impulsive. And how does that connect to lethal means then? If somebody is going to attempt to take their life, if they have access to lethal means, more cases than not, it won't be just an attempt, it'll be the worst case scenario where the person might die by suicide. And this is where, when we understand the impulsivity behind suicide and its connection with lethal means, not only reminds us that there's a very important connection, but then what can we do as far as our prevention efforts with respect directly to reducing access to lethal means. Many suicide attempts are made with little planning during a personal crisis. And again, that's kind of what that slide just said beforehand, but it's realizing this, and I'm going to say this probably a little bit later, but let me be very clear now too, is if you're on this call as an expert in this field of suicide prevention and mental health and suicidology, not everybody knows as much information as we know. And sometimes it comes across to some of us as common sense, but I remind myself constantly, many of the groups that I work with, they don't dedicate, their whole career is not dedicated to this. And we have to recall, when we're doing this preventative, proactive outreach, quite often what people don't know, they don't know. And it's our job to help them understand it, but also to do it in a fair and compassionate way that's not coming across as condescending, for example. Very important. So what do we want to do? If we understand impulsivity connected to suicide, we have time and distance between the lethal means and the person that's feeling suicidal. And that's where, again, we look at that for the person at risk. If we're creating that time and distance, that helps reduce the impulsivity and help them get through that acute risk period, which is yet again critical to trying to keep that person staying alive. And then we look at all the different people involved, whether it's crisis counselors, whether it's police, or those dual roles of those people of those new units that they have, the co-response units, handing them off to the more proper long-term care and support that the person that was at risk that needs. But it's trying to create that time and distance prior. And that's where the preventative, proactive work, I think, truly is very critical yet again. So what are we looking at other means? And let's just look at in the world of policing. And here's just some photos that I have up here on the screen. Excuse me. And how important, and I know the American, for example, just using one example, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, who I work very closely with in a variety of ways, the national office, as well as the New York City chapter, storage for firearms. How important storage for firearms truly is. And there's a variety of storage, as you see some of these photos on here, whether leaving your firearm at work. Some cops will say, and again, I'm looking at it in my world of law enforcement, I'm never leaving my firearm at work. I'm not here to argue with anybody, especially in this context. And I'm sure in the discussions later, if you want to argue with me, I guess we have time for that. But for the purpose of this, when we're working towards trying to prevent suicide in law enforcement, and again, I mentioned law enforcement specifically, look at this in other fields as well and connecting those dots. If they're not going to leave their firearm at work, okay, what about when they bring it home? Whether they have a safe. Many agencies require you to have a safe, but not only just a safe, what about you see that lock up on the top where you're disabling it and there's the key required, and asking, well, hey, why not leave the key somewhere else within your house? Or with the safe, maybe put it somewhere not in your bedroom or somewhere else, creating that time and distance if somebody's at risk. The one on the right, when I was just looking up images, I came across that. I'm not sure if there's data or research on that, but that was captivating for me. It's not just firearms. What about access? Another type of lethal means is access to prescriptions, whether it's prescribed to you, somebody in your household, or as the professional in the medical field having access to lethal doses of prescriptions, putting them in these type of lock boxes. But then also I just noticed with that photo on there and sort of trying to create that time and distance buffer. It's not just physically, sometimes the time and distance is also the cognitive, getting people to slow down, stop and pause. An example of how does any of this play out in real life? The work that I'm involved in helping officers in crisis in that time and distance aspect, speaking to them and asking them if they're in the midst of the crisis. And I'm not talking about at the moment, say they are at the stage of being suicidal. It's before that, they're in a personal crisis, but asking them about their firearm, asking the suicide question. Even if the answer is no, talking to them about leaving maybe their firearm at work for the time being and posing it as temporary as well, saying, hey, maybe for the next couple of days while we try to connect you with work. It's same thing if they have doses, if they're being prescribed medicine, and if there's a concern with that, maybe again, separating it, maybe leaving some of it at work, some of it at home, having somebody else in the household holding on to it. And these are all those ideas. And look, we can come up with a bunch of different examples of why it might not work. That's why it's having different options truly is critical. But here's the other thing too. And when I get into the recommendations, it's the idea of what's realistic and how do we apply it. Here's the thing in policing. I think one of the key things to fighting stigma and trying to reduce suicide in policing, it's that idea of reminding officers their sole identity cannot be their attachment to their firearm or their police shield. And if they have to have their firearm taken away for a temporary amount of time while they get more help and support, that doesn't make them any less of a man or woman. And this is where it's truly saying this kind of stuff flat out and being upfront. Reducing the access to lethal means saves lives. Let me be very clear. Let me say that again. Reducing access to lethal means saves lives. The data is very conclusive with that. So what can we do? And again, I'll speak in terms of law enforcement, but also general broad base. We need to be proactive with our outreach. We need to educate people. Like I mentioned that earlier, it can't be limited to just the people that know this stuff. We have to make sure other people in our professions understand that, but also even take a moment for the professionals that are involved in part of the outreach. How often is your outreach addressing lethal means reduction? And I'll just say anecdotally, coming across different groups that I've worked with, it doesn't always come up. And I'm not knocking anybody. It's just good to have reminders. And sometimes, yeah, it is good to preach to the choir, not just the people that don't know. It can't be just suicide prevention. What do I mean by that? There's a couple of examples when we talk about guns. And again, gun safety. Forget about suicide prevention, although this definitely helps with that. Suicide prevention and gun safety go hand in hand if you have kids at home, if you live with anybody else. Same thing with the prescriptions or other potentially deadly or dangerous equipment in the household. Where do you keep it safe so other people don't get access to it? And it's not just about you. And that's why number 2 says it's not just suicide prevention, but also it's not just you combine 1 and 2. It's not just doing an outreach on suicide prevention. If there's other trainings, if there's other stuff going on, how do you just add maybe these just as little doses and little tidbits or reminders to people? Then ultimately, it's number 3 when we're talking to somebody about if they're in crisis, making sure we ask. And again, here's the clear typical one that we say if it's a law enforcement officer, asking where their firearm is, right? Their duty firearm or their agency firearm that they've been given. What about remembering to ask, do they own other firearms? Do they live with somebody that has access or that owns a firearm? And those are the things, if we don't plan beforehand, they could be easily overlooked. And this is why it's critical, these action steps as part of our preparation and proactive preventative outreach. And also the idea, again, separating that attachment to whatever it is as their sole identity, whether it's the firearm, whatever the tools they might have. We want to talk about getting people help and looking at the immediate moment. And it can be temporary. And they can get their firearm back, or they can be starting, back if they were a doctor or a nurse and practice in medicine or in other fields, even construction or somewhere else. It's just looking, let's work on the immediate crisis at hand. There are a bunch of resources here. I just wanted to share a bit of my insight and my experiences with you. You can learn more there too. And again, just another specific example of having personally have helped law enforcement officers in the midst of crisis. And realizing we can't forget there's that ambivalence that, there might be part of them that does want to die by suicide, but there's also part of them that wants to live. And truly asking about the firearms, quite often they're more than willing to turn it over, or they're more than willing to leave it at work if they're not suicidal, but they know they're not in a great place. But all it takes is that little nudge from the person looking to help them. And that's the role many of us here today can play, that vital, vital role. And don't forget, I'll turn it back over to you, Jody. I hope some of you found this helpful. I'm always happy to help others, connect others with other information, but I really, truly appreciate this opportunity to share a bit of my work and background.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for joining us today and to share this important information and the critical resources and recommendations. So as we conclude our webinar today, I encourage all of you watching to take action and take action today. We want to encourage you to visit www.workplacesuicideprevention.com. On that site, you'll be invited to take a pledge to make suicide prevention a health and safety priority for your workplace or professional organization. Thank you again, Dr. Thompson, and thank you to everybody who joined us today.